I never thought my first day at Hartwell University would turn into a complete disaster. Everyone around me was buzzing about one thing and one thing only: Zane Holloway. The name moved through the crowd like electricity, jumping from one mouth to the next before the morning had even properly started. People were practically tripping over themselves just to catch a glimpse of him, like he was a visiting professor or a visiting god, not just another student with a sketchbook and an ego. But me, I was just trying to find Studio Hall without making a scene. My hoodie was pulled low over my face because my omega scent felt unusually strong today. I'd taken my omega blockers at 6 in the morning, double-checked the dosage, then checked again because paranoia had always been my most faithful companion. But it still crawled up my spine the whole walk across campus. What if someone noticed? What if they figured out what I was and decided that made me easy? The thought alone knotted my stomach tight. Hartwell University was one of the most prestigious architecture schools in the country. It was also one of the most alpha-heavy campuses I'd ever set foot on. For an Omega on a full academic scholarship, invisibility wasn't just smart, it was armor. When I finally found the lecture hall and pushed through the heavy glass doors, the entire room went silent. Every head turned in my direction, and I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. There was exactly one empty seat left in the whole sun-drenched, drafting table-filled space, right in the center of the room. And sitting at the table directly beside it, Zane Holloway. He looked exactly like the rumors described: sharp, clean jaw, dark eyes that didn't look at things so much as through them, an aura of complete self-containment that radiated off him like a low-frequency hum, the kind of presence that made everyone else in the room feel slightly less real by comparison. He was bent over his sketchbook, pencil moving in long, deliberate strokes, completely unbothered by the fact that I existed. I considered standing at the back. The professor had already spotted me, though, and was gesturing impatiently toward the empty seat. I walked down the aisle, sat, kept my eyes forward and my breathing controlled. For 15 full minutes, it was fine. I actually started to relax. That lasted exactly until Zane turned his head. His movement was so sudden I flinched, my pencil skidding across my page and leaving a jagged scratch through my notes. "You're pencil tapping," he said, voice low, flat, like he was correcting a minor architectural error. "It's distracting." My mouth fell open slightly. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. Nervous habit, the eraser bouncing against the desk in a rhythm I couldn't hear myself. I stared at him. He was already looking back at his sketchbook like the matter was settled. Something burned through my chest. I knew it was anger. I chose to keep calling it anger. My omega instincts were screaming something completely different about how close he was sitting, about the dark cedar warmth of his scent slipping under my blockers. And I was not listening to any of that. I turned to face him fully, met those dark, unbothered eyes with every ounce of steadiness I had. I never thought my sense of entitlement would turn into a complete disaster, I said, quietly. For one suspended second, something cracked open in his expression. His eyes widened, just barely, just enough, like I'd spoken in a language he hadn't heard before. Like nobody at this entire university had ever looked him in the face and pushed back. Maybe nobody had. He said nothing, turned back to his sketchbook. The rest of the lecture passed in tense, loaded silence. Zane didn't look at me again, didn't say another word, but I could feel the weight of him beside me, like a physical pressure against my ribs. When Professor Marin finally dismissed us, I packed my things fast and moved. I made it to the hallway before I felt it, that prickle at the back of my neck, that specific, unmistakable feeling of being watched. I turned around. Zane stood about 10 feet away,
arms crossed, a slow, dangerous half-smile pulling at the corner of his mouth that had absolutely no business being as destructive as it was. "Which house do you register under?" he asked, casual voice, intense eyes. "I'll have a conversation with them by tomorrow. There are protocols for disrespecting someone's space." My blood moved hot and fast. I walked straight toward him instead of away, closed the distance until I could smell that cedar and cool concrete scent, and my Omega instincts went absolutely haywire in ways I refused to acknowledge. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level despite the way my hands wanted to shake. I turned and walked away, did not look back, did not give him the satisfaction. But my hands were trembling by the time I pushed through the exit doors and stepped into the open air. I'd just looked Zane Holloway in the eye and told him exactly where to go on my very first day. That was either the bravest thing I'd ever done or the most catastrophic mistake I'd ever made. Probably both. As I crossed campus toward my small off-grounds apartment, I couldn't shake the image of his face, that split second of genuine surprise. The way the half-smile that followed it felt less like amusement and more like interest, like I'd just become a problem he actually wanted to solve. I pushed the thought away hard. But even as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, something settled in my chest like a quiet warning, a certainty I didn't want and couldn't argue with. This wasn't over. Whatever had just started between me and Zane Holloway, it was only the beginning of something far more complicated than I was anywhere near ready for. I just didn't know yet how completely right I was.
The next morning, I knew something was wrong before I even reached the main building. People were staring. Not the casual, fleeting kind of glance you got for being a new face on campus. This was full, deliberate, heads turning as I walked staring, accompanied by whispers behind cupped hands, and the kind of pointed looks that made your skin feel too tight. My stomach dropped somewhere around my knees as I pushed through the morning crowd, keeping my face blank and my pace steady. By lunchtime, I had the full picture. Zane had talked. Not loudly, not dramatically, that wasn't his style apparently. He'd simply mentioned our encounter to the right people, and those people had told everyone else, and now the entire campus knew that some unknown scholarship Omega had the audacity to speak to Zane Holloway the way I had. The story had grown legs overnight. Some versions had me shouting at him. One version, bafflingly, had me throwing something. Fantastic. Day 2, and I was already a campus legend for the wrong reasons. But I'd survived worse. Much worse. I'd grown up in a group home where Omegas were treated like inconveniences at best and liabilities at worst. I'd studied with cracked phone screens and borrowed textbooks and exactly zero support from anyone who was supposed to care. I'd earned my place at Hartwell through sheer bloody-minded stubbornness and a GPA that nobody could argue with. One arrogant Enigma and his whispering fan club, that was nothing. I could walk through nothing with my eyes closed. So I stuck to my routine with iron discipline. Classes, studio practice, library, home. I didn't engage with the stares, didn't flinch at the whispers, kept my head down and my focus locked on the reason I was here in the first place. Zane, though, had other ideas. He was everywhere. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. The campus coffee cart at 8 in the morning, sure, people needed caffeine. The West Wing library during my usual study block, fine. Maybe he actually used libraries. The courtyard outside my materials science class, that one was harder to explain, but I tried. By Thursday, I couldn't explain anything away anymore. Zane Holloway was following me. Sometimes openly, arms crossed, dark eyes tracking me with no particular effort to hide it. Other times, just a presence at the edge of my vision, a familiar silhouette at the end of a corridor, there when I looked up from my drafting table, gone when I looked again. It made me hyper-aware of everything,
My routes across campus, my timing, the way I held my bag, the way I breathed. Thursday afternoon, I was deep in the library working through a structural analysis problem when his shadow fell across my page. I didn't look up. "Do you think you're special?" His voice cut through the quiet like a drafting knife, clean, precise, designed to land. I closed my textbook slowly, looked up. He stood over my table with his hands in his pockets, expression balanced somewhere between curious and condescending, like he was an interesting blueprint he hadn't quite figured out how to read yet. I replied, "I think you have too much free time. Don't you have a portfolio to work on, some award to collect?" Something moved along his jaw, a muscle tightening. For a moment, I thought I'd actually cracked the surface, thought I'd see something real underneath all that careful, practiced composure. Instead, he smiled. Not warm, not amused, something darker and more deliberate that sent a slow shiver through me I absolutely refused to name. "I'm starting to find you interesting." His voice dropped lower. "This thing you do, the pushback, most people don't." I was already shoving papers into my bag. That wasn't a compliment, and we both knew it. It was a declaration. He wasn't going to get bored and walk away. My resistance wasn't a deterrent. It was the opposite. It was pulling him closer in. I stood, bag on my shoulder, and walked away without a word. I made it halfway to the exit when the panic hit, and it had nothing to do with Zane. I felt it the way you feel a light going out, that soft, sudden drop in the invisible barrier my blockers built around my scent. My hand flew to my jacket pocket. Empty. I'd used the last dose of my emergency inhaler this morning and completely forgotten to refill the prescription. My blockers were failing. I was standing in the middle of Hartwell's main library, surrounded by alphas and enigmas who would be able to smell exactly what I was within minutes. My breathing went shallow. If anyone reported me, if anyone noticed and filed a complaint, I could lose everything. My scholarship, my place here, my future, gone because of one stupid, distracted morning. A shadow fell over me, and I looked up. Zane stood there. Close, too close, and his eyes had changed completely. Pupils blown wide and dark, nostrils flaring slightly as he breathed in. He knew. That scent. His voice had gone rough at the edges, stripped of its usual precision. "That's you?" I stepped back until the wall stopped me. "Stay away from me." He stepped forward instead.
There was nothing calculated about the way Zane moved toward me. That was what scared me most. Every other time I'd seen him, in lecture, in the library, across the courtyard, he'd been controlled, deliberate, a person who measured every word and every step before committing to either. But right now, that person was gone. What stood in front of me was something older and more instinctive, his Enigma nature responding to my uncovered Omega scent with a directness that bypassed every social filter he owned. His eyes were almost completely dark. Omegas aren't permitted on campus without active suppressants. His voice was rough, uneven at the edges. "You know that." My back was flat against the wall. "I know. You could report this right now." He wasn't moving closer anymore, but he wasn't stepping back either, just standing there, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off him, his jaw tight like he was fighting something internal. "You understand what that means for your scholarship." I did. I understood it completely, and the knowledge sat in my chest like a stone dropping through still water. Everything I had built, everything I had sacrificed and pushed through and refused to quit on, all of it balanced on the edge of one conversation. I held his gaze anyway. It was the only thing I had left. Then Zane did something I was entirely unprepared for. He shrugged off his jacket, expensive, dark, structured at the shoulders, and draped it around me in one smooth, unhesitating motion. The fabric swallowed me. His scent hit my senses immediately and completely. Cedar,
cool concrete, something underneath both of those things that was just him, warm and grounding in a way that made my omega instincts go dangerously, traitorously quiet. "Keep it on until you're off campus," he said. His voice had steadied again, but only slightly. "And tomorrow, you'd better have proper blockers sorted. We won't be doing this again." I stared at him. "Why?" The word came out smaller than I intended. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't name, and he clearly wasn't going to let me examine. Then he turned and walked away through the library stacks, without answering, without looking back, disappearing between the shelves like he'd never been there at all. I stood there wrapped in his jacket, his scent wrapped around me like something protective, and I had absolutely no framework for what had just happened. Zane disappeared after that. 2 full days. No courtyard appearances, no library shadows, no dark eyes tracking me across the campus coffee cart. People said he was dealing with family business. Someone claimed he had been unwell. I told myself firmly and repeatedly that his whereabouts were none of my concern, and I had studying to do. I kept the jacket. I told myself it was because I needed to return it clean, that it would be basic bad manners to give it back any other way. I was definitely not keeping it because something about his scent settled the constant low hum of anxiety that lived in my chest. I was absolutely not pulling it from my bag at night and breathing it in until my thoughts finally stopped racing long enough to let me sleep. I had it dry cleaned, folded it carefully, stored it in my studio locker, and checked my phone more than I would ever admit out loud for any sign that he was back on campus. He returned on the 3rd day. I was at my locker when I heard his voice behind me, low, unhurried, like no time had passed at all. "My jacket." I turned around. He looked different. Not dramatically, not in any way I could easily explain, but there were faint shadows under his eyes and something slightly rough about his voice, like sleep had been hard to come by. He looked tired in the specific way that made people look more real, less like the untouchable thing everyone on campus had constructed around his actual face. I pulled the jacket from my locker and held it out. "It's clean," I said, "and thank you for what you did." He reached for it. His fingers crossed over mine on the fabric, and the contact lasted less than a second, but it moved through my arm like a current, sharp and unmistakable. His eyes shifted. He'd felt it too. I could see it in the slight stillness that came over him. He cleared his throat. "Do you live alone?" he asked. "Why?" "Curious." Something in his voice had changed. The sharp edge of it softened in a way I didn't know what to do with. I said yes carefully, and I like it that way. He nodded once, something turning over behind his eyes, then walked away. I stood at my locker staring after him and trying to understand how every single interaction with this person managed to leave me more confused than the one before it. The shift happened gradually, then, all at once. The whispers stopped. The stares that had followed me since day 2 simply ceased. People who had been deliberately cold now stepped aside in hallways like I carried something they didn't want to challenge. It was so complete and so sudden that it took me 2 days to notice and another day to understand. My friend Cole found me in the campus cafe and gave me a look I didn't like at all. "Zane put the word out," he said, stirring his drink slowly. "Full protection. Nobody touches you, nobody bothers you. It's done." The heat that moved through me was pure anger. I picked up my phone and typed before I could think twice, "Stop interfering in my life." His response came in seconds. "No." I stared at that single word for a long time. Then I put my phone down and started planning. I found him in the main cafeteria the next morning. Zane sat at the center table. Of course he did. It was the most visible spot in the entire room, surrounded by the usual constellation of people who orbited him like he was something with gravitational pull. I walked straight through all of it. The noise in the cafeteria dropped a degree as I approached.
I felt the shift in attention, felt eyes track my movement, but I kept my focus locked on Zane and didn't slow down. "I don't need your protection," I said, loud enough to carry, calm enough to mean it. Zane looked up from his coffee. His expression was completely unhurried, like he'd been expecting this conversation and already decided how it ended. "You don't have a choice in it. You're on this campus. That makes you my concern. I'm not your anything." The words came out sharper than I planned, but the anger behind them was real, and I wasn't interested in softening it. Something tightened around his eyes. Not anger exactly, something more careful than that. "You think this is about control?" His voice dropped, pulling the conversation inward despite the very public setting. "You think I'm doing this for myself? I think you're doing it because nobody has ever told you that you can't, and that's not good enough." "Then let me be clearer." He set his coffee down and looked at me directly, all that practiced composure stripped back to something more honest underneath. "This campus has people in it who would target an Omega without a pack connection, without blinking. I've seen it happen. I'm not going to watch it happen to you." "Then tell me why." The words burst out of me before I could measure them. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me? We don't know each other. We don't even like each other." The cafeteria had gone very quiet. Zane stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only I could hear it, and the careful armor of his usual composure had cracked just enough to show something raw underneath. "If something happened to you, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself for it." The words hit me somewhere I wasn't defended against. This wasn't territory. It wasn't dominance or power or any of the Enigma mechanics I'd build my wariness around. This was something personal and unguarded and landed in my chest with a weight I wasn't ready for. Before I could find a single word to answer with, he picked up his coffee, stepped around the table, and walked out of the cafeteria. I stood there in the middle of the room with everyone watching, and my heart doing things it had absolutely no business doing. Cole found me 20 minutes later on a bench outside the East Wing, staring at nothing in particular. "That was intense. You holding up?" "I don't understand him," I said, honest, because Cole was one of the only people I was honest with. Everything he does contradicts the last thing. He's arrogant, and then he's not. He's controlling, and then he says something like that, and I don't know what to do with it. "Maybe he's both," Cole said simply. "People usually are." I looked at him. "He hasn't hurt you, though," Cole continued, quieter now. "Not once. Every time things got difficult, he moved towards you instead of away. That's not nothing, Eli." I didn't answer. That night, I lay on my bed in my small apartment and stared at the ceiling and tried to be rational about this. Zane Holloway was exactly the kind of person I'd built walls against, powerful, certain of himself in ways that could flatten other people without him even noticing. Everything about him should have kept me at a careful, safe distance. But he'd covered for me in the library when he could have ended my time at Hartwell with a single conversation. He'd draped his jacket around me without hesitating. He said if something happened to you, I wouldn't forgive myself in a room full of people, like it cost him something real to say it. And the worst part, the part I lay there in the dark actively fighting against, was that some part of me had already started to care back. Not loudly, not in any way I could point to and say, there, that's where it started. Just quietly, the way water finds its way under a door, persistent and unhurried, and impossible to stop once it had begun. I picked up my phone, stared at his name and my contacts. I hadn't even registered saving it, but there it was. I typed before I could talk myself out of it. "I need time to think about all of this." 3 dots appeared immediately, like he'd been holding his phone. "Take all you need. I'm not going anywhere. When you're ready, I'll be here." I set the phone face down on my chest and closed my eyes. Outside my window, the campus settled into its nighttime quiet, and somewhere in the middle of all my careful, constructed resistance, something small and stubborn and terrifying had already decided that Zane Holloway might be worth the risk.
I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet.
The annual Enigma Alpha Showcase was the kind of event I would normally have walked past without a second thought. It wasn't designed for people like me. The guest list ran on status and connection, and the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to fight for a seat at any table. Omegas weren't exactly the target demographic, which suited me perfectly because I had a structural analysis due Friday and absolutely no interest in watching Enigmas and Alphas perform for each other in expensive clothing. Cole had other ideas. "You never go anywhere," he said, planting himself in the doorway of the studio room where I was working late, arms folded across his considerable frame with the energy of someone who had made a decision on my behalf and was simply informing me of it. "You're a person, not a machine." "I'm a person with a deadline. The deadline is Friday. This is Wednesday. Come." I wanted to argue. I had good arguments ready, logical, reasonable, well-structured arguments. But Cole had that particular expression that meant he would stand in that doorway for however long it took, and I was too tired to outlast him. I went. The venue was everything I'd expected and nothing I wanted. A converted gallery space in Hartwell's arts building, dressed up with warm lighting and clean architectural lines that I would have appreciated more if I hadn't been immediately aware of how out of place I was. Everyone around me moved with the fluent ease of people who had grown up in rooms like this. Designer clothes worn casually, conversations flowing without effort, laughter that didn't have anything nervous underneath it. I found a corner, acquired a glass of sparkling water, began calculating how long I needed to stay before Cole would accept my exit without guilt-tripping me about it for a week. 40 minutes. 40 minutes felt reasonable. Then the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight reorientation of bodies, conversations tapering, attention pulling toward the far end of the gallery, where a low platform had been set up. Zane appeared from a side door and moved through the parted crowd with the kind of unhurried ease that made it look like the room had arranged itself around him, rather than him navigating it. The applause started before he even reached the platform. I stayed in my corner, kept my expression neutral, watched. He took the microphone like he'd been born holding one, launched into something about design philosophy and the responsibility of shaping spaces that shaped people, the kind of speech that could have been pretentious coming from anyone else, but landed differently in his voice. People leaned forward. The room held its breath. I told myself I was observing critically. Then his eyes moved across the room and found mine. Everything went strange and quiet. Not silent. The room was still full of sound, but it became distant, like someone had turned the volume down on everything except the specific frequency of him looking at me. Several seconds passed, long enough that it wasn't accidental, long enough that his rhythm faltered, just barely, just a fraction of a step, and he glanced down at his notes to recover. Nobody else noticed. They were too absorbed in their own admiration to catch the crack in his composure, but I caught it. I saw exactly what I did to his concentration, and something about that knowledge moved through me warm and quiet and deeply inconvenient. I decided it was time to leave. I set my glass down and started moving toward the exit, threading through clusters of conversation with my head down, focused on the door. Fresh air, my apartment, Friday's deadline. Things that made sense. I was close, 10 feet from the exit. A hand closed around my wrist. I stopped. The person attached to that hand was not Zane. He was broad-shouldered and glassy-eyed and smelled strongly from whatever was in the glasses that definitely weren't sparkling water. I recognized him vaguely. Brennan Holt, third year, the kind of person who filled a room with noise and called that personality. "You're the one everyone's talking about," he said, words slightly imprecise at the edges. "Zane's Omega." I kept my voice level. "That's not what I am. Excuse me." I tried to step around him. His grip tightened. "Means you're available then." His smile was the kind that had never been told no and believed that was a natural law rather than a failure of his surroundings.
Panic moved through my system fast and cold. My omega instincts flooded me with sharp, insistent alarm, the biological imperative to pull away, to create distance, to find safety. I pulled against his grip. He didn't release. Let go of me. My voice stayed steady. It cost me something to keep it that way. Then his hand was simply gone. Not gradually, gone, ripped away with a force that made Brennan stumble sideways, and Zane stood between us, with his back to me and his entire body radiating something that wasn't quite human anymore. His Enigma aura had expanded outward like a pressure front moving through the room. People nearby stepped back without understanding why. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it worse. "You put your hands on him." It wasn't a question. It was the moment before a verdict. Brennan's confidence evaporated completely. I didn't know I was just, leave. One word, absolute and immovable as a load-bearing wall. Brennan left.
The crowd around us had gone completely still. Zane didn't seem to notice or care. His attention had already moved past Brennan entirely, turning toward me with an immediacy that made everything else in the room feel peripheral. His eyes tracked over me quickly, checking, assessing, and the fury that had been radiating off him moments ago shifted into something different, something quieter and more careful. He reached for my wrist, the same one Brennan had grabbed. His touch was so completely different that my breath caught on the contrast, gentle and unhurried, his thumb moving lightly over the skin where Brennan's grip had been too tight, checking for marks, making sure. Then he laced his fingers through mine and guided me toward a side door I hadn't noticed, away from the crowd and the noise and the weight of everyone watching. The door opened onto a narrow balcony overlooking the campus grounds. The night air hit my face immediately, cool and clean, and a relief so physical I nearly closed my eyes. Below us, the university spread out in its nighttime version, amber lights tracing the paths between buildings, everything quieter and smaller from up here. Zane stood close, not crowding me, just present, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off him, could hear that his breathing was still slightly uneven. The rage hadn't fully left his system yet. It was still moving through him, looking for somewhere to go. "Are you hurt?" His voice had come down from that razor quiet he'd used against Brennan. It was just his voice now, stripped of performance. "No," I paused. "My wrist is fine." He nodded. His jaw was still tight. Without asking permission, which should have bothered me more than it did, he took both of my hands in his and held them, not restrictively, just held them. The steadiness of it moved up my arms and into my chest, and my breathing slowed in a way I couldn't entirely take credit for. "This is why," he said, low and direct, his eyes on mine. "This exact situation, this is why I can't just step back and let you navigate this campus alone, like it's neutral ground. It isn't neutral, not for you." "I'm not your responsibility," I said, but the argument felt thinner than it used to, like a structure I'd built carefully that was showing its load-bearing weaknesses. "Yes, you are," he said it, without heat, without dominance, just with a certainty that sat differently than arrogance. "You might not see it yet, but you are." "What does that mean?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. "What does any of this mean, Zane? You follow me around campus, you protect me, you say things like that, and then you walk away without explaining any of it. I'm tired of half the picture." He released my hands, took one step back, and for the first time since I'd met him, Zane Holloway looked like someone who didn't know what to do with himself. The composure was still there, but it was working harder than usual. Something underneath it was pressing up against the surface, looking for a way out. "Forget it," he said. "It doesn't matter tonight. What matters is that you're okay." "It matters to me." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said nothing, turned, and went back inside. I stayed on the balcony alone for several minutes, my hands still warm where his had been,
the night air doing very little to cool the confusion burning steadily through my chest. By morning, Hartwell had a new story. Brennan of Holt had been suspended, effective immediately, pending a formal review of conduct violations. The documentation had apparently been thorough and swift. Security footage, witness accounts, a written report filed before midnight. All of it submitted by Zane. I sat with that information over my morning coffee and tried to locate my anger about it. It was there, smaller than I expected. Underneath it was something else I had less experience naming. I found Zane between classes outside the materials lab, pulled him into an empty studio room before he could redirect the conversation, and closed the door behind us. Brennan's suspension. Yes. You did that without asking me. I did. No apology in his voice, no defensiveness either, just straight acknowledgement, which was somehow harder to push against than either. You can't keep making decisions that affect my life without talking to me first. That's not protection. That's control. Something moved across his face. You think those are the same thing? Aren't they? No. He stepped forward, not aggressively, just closing the distance enough that I could see the detail in his expression clearly, the thing he was working to say. Control takes. Protection gives. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Eli. I never have been. My name in his mouth landed differently every time. I hadn't figured out how to become indifferent to it. Then tell me the truth. All of it. Why me? Why any of this? The studio room was quiet around us, light falling through the high windows and clean architectural lines across the floor. Zane's hands opened and closed at his sides. And then he told me, "Because you're my fated mate." The words dropped into the silence between us like something structural giving way, the kind of sound a building makes when a load-bearing element shifts, everything holding steady, and then, suddenly, fundamentally not. My brain stopped processing in any useful way. "That's," he said quietly, "real. I know what you're going to say. I know."
The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. I took a step backward. My shoulders found the wall behind me, and I stayed there, using it, needing something solid and fixed while everything inside me tilted off its axis. "Fated mates aren't real," I said. "They're in novels. There's something people say when they want to romanticize biology. I know what it sounds like. It sounds like an excuse." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "It sounds like a very elegant way of explaining behavior that should probably just be called obsession." Something flickered across his face. Not offense, more like patience being actively chosen. "The night in the library, when your blockers failed, the moment your scent broke through," he stopped, pressed his jaw together briefly like he was editing himself for accuracy. "It wasn't attraction, Eli. It wasn't even want. It was recognition. My Enigma side knew before I did, before I had words for any of it." I stared at him. "Enigmas recognize their fated mates on a biological level," he continued. "I didn't choose this. I didn't plan it or manufacture it or use it as a strategy. It just was. And everything after that was me trying to figure out what to do with something I hadn't asked for either." The silence stretched between us. I wanted to find the argument. I was good at arguments, at locating the structural weakness in a position and applying precise pressure until it gave way. But I was standing in a studio room with Zane Holloway looking at me like I was the only fixed point in his personal geography, and I couldn't find the flaw to press on because nothing he was saying felt false. That was the most frightening part. "You should have told me," I said finally. "The moment you knew, you should have told me, instead of following me around campus and making unilateral decisions about my safety and letting me think this was just some power game. I know. No deflection, no qualification. I didn't know how. Every time I got close enough to say it, you looked at me like you were ready to dismantle whatever I said next, and He stopped again. Something almost rueful moved across his face. You're the first person who has ever made me genuinely nervous, Eli. I didn't handle that particularly well. Something cracked open in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. Zane Holloway, nervous, because of me. I thought about every interaction we'd had from the beginning. The way that first flash of surprise had crossed his face in the lecture hall when I pushed back. The jacket in the library. Immediate, unhesitating, no calculation in it. The balcony. His hands holding mine with that steadiness that had moved through me like something settling into place. I thought about the 2 days he'd disappeared from campus and how loud his absence had been. I thought about the fact that I'd saved his contact in my phone without noticing I'd done it. I don't know how to do this, I said honestly. I don't know how to. I've spent every day at Hartwell making sure I didn't need anyone, making sure nobody had enough access to matter. That's not an accident. That's architecture. I built it deliberately. I know, he said softly. And you gestured vaguely at him, at the whole impossible situation. You showed up and started taking walls apart without a blueprint. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, but quieter than that, more real. I can work with a blueprint, he said, if you give me one. I looked at him for a long moment. Then the reality of what he'd said, fated mate, biological recognition, the whole weight of it crashed back through me, and the fear came with it, fast and cold. I wasn't ready. I picked up my bag. I need to think. I need space and time, and I need you to not follow me for once while I figure out what I'm actually feeling versus what my omega biology is telling me to feel. He nodded immediately. No argument, no pressure. Okay. I mean it, Zane. I know you do. He stepped aside, clearing my path to the door. Take what you need. I'll be here. I left. I went straight to Cole's apartment and knocked until he answered in his sleep shirt, looking deeply unimpressed. I told him everything. He listened the way he always did, without interrupting, without performing shock, just taking it all in with that steady, unhurried attention that had made me my only real friend at Hartwell. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. Fated mates are actually real, he said thoughtfully. I always thought that was just something older Omegas said. Apparently not. And you ran. I needed to think. You needed to panic in a controlled environment, Cole corrected gently, which is valid. But Eli, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Strip away the biology. Strip away the Enigma and Omega mechanics and all of it. What do you actually feel when you're with him? I opened my mouth, closed it. The honest answer was seen. I felt seen in a way I hadn't built a defense against because I hadn't known to expect it. Terrified, I said instead. Cole nodded like that was the same answer. That night, alone in my apartment, I picked up my phone. I need time. 3 dots. Then, take all you need. I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. I read it 3 times. Then I turned off my lamp and lay in the dark and felt, very quietly, the walls I'd built so carefully beginning to decide for themselves whether they still wanted to stand.
2 weeks passed in a strange, suspended quiet. Zane kept his word. He didn't follow me, didn't appear at the edges of my vision or materialize in doorways or find reasons to occupy the same spaces I occupied. He was present on campus the way weather was present,
I was aware of him without direct contact, caught glimpses across courtyards and through studio windows, felt the fact of him without it pressing on me. And somewhere inside that quiet, something shifted. I noticed his absence the way you notice a sound that stops, not immediately, but in the accumulation of its goneness. The campus felt different without his orbit around me, larger in ways that weren't entirely comfortable. I'd spend so much energy resisting his presence that I hadn't properly accounted for what the space would feel like once he actually respected my boundaries and withdrew from it. It felt emptier than I wanted to admit. I threw myself into work, finished the structural analysis, started the semester project, a residential design brief that was supposed to demonstrate understanding of how spaces shaped the people who inhabited them. I sat with that concept for 3 days before I realized I kept designing rooms with 2 points of entry, spaces that felt protected without feeling enclosed, architecture that accounted for someone who needed both safety and the ability to leave. I deleted the file twice, started again both times. Cole came by on a Thursday evening, let himself in with the spare key I'd given him against my better judgment, and sat on my kitchen counter eating my crackers while I stared at my drafting screen. "You figured it out," he said. "Not a question. I haven't figured out anything. You've got that look. I don't have a look. Eli," he set the crackers down, "you've been designing a home for 2 people for 3 days. I can see your screen from here." I looked at my screen. He wasn't wrong. I closed the laptop. I found Zane in the East Wing studio late on a Friday afternoon when most of the building had emptied out for the weekend. He was at a drafting table in the far corner, bent over a large format drawing, working with the same focused precision I'd watched from across the lecture hall on the very first day. He looked up when I came in, didn't move, didn't speak, just waited the way he'd promised he would. I crossed the studio and stopped at the edge of his table. "I've been thinking," I said. "I know. I'm not good at this." I held his gaze because looking away felt like losing something. I don't have practice trusting people. I don't have a template for it. Everything I know about relying on someone else I learned from watching it go wrong. "I know that too," he said quietly. "And this isn't me saying I'm ready for everything, the fated mate part, the biology, all of it. I need to get there at my own speed without being rushed by something I didn't choose." He nodded, patient and unhurried as ever. "But," I continued, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, "I've spent 2 weeks trying to find a logical reason why what I feel when I'm with you is just omega biology misfiring, and I can't find it. I've looked. I'm thorough." Something moved across his face that I'd never seen there before. Not confidence or composure or that careful, controlled expression he showed the world. Just hope, plain and unguarded, and more devastating than anything else he'd ever aimed at me. "I called you entitled on the first day." "You did. You were." "Also true. And you covered for me in the library when you could have ended everything I'd worked for. And you put yourself between me and Brennan without hesitating. And you said—" I stopped, steadied. "You said if something happened to me, you wouldn't forgive yourself. And I've been carrying that sentence around for weeks because I don't know what to do with someone who means something like that." Zane stood up slowly from his drafting stool. He didn't cross the distance between us. He just stood, giving me the space to make the next move or not make it entirely on my terms. "I'm not asking you to have it all figured out. I'm not asking for everything at once. He paused, and the rawness in his voice was something I understood now, recognized as what happened when someone who spent their whole life being performed at tried to say something true instead. "I just want to be in your life, Eli. Whatever version of that you're willing to let me have." I crossed the remaining distance. It wasn't far. A few steps across a studio floor on a quiet Friday afternoon with the late light coming through high windows at the angle that made even ordinary spaces feel significant. I stopped close enough that I had to look up slightly to hold his gaze. "I never wanted to be here. I know. I'm glad you're here. Don't make me regret this." "I won't. No performance in it.
No arrogance, just the quiet, load-bearing certainty of someone who meant exactly what they said. I reached up and took his hand. His fingers closed around mine with that same steadiness I'd felt on the balcony, warm and grounding and unhurried, like he'd been holding this particular moment carefully since the beginning, making sure it didn't get damaged on the way here. We stood like that for a while, not needing it to be anything more than what it was. Later, when I told Cole, he simply said, "Finally," and went back to eating my crackers. Zane was arrogant and controlled and had dismantled every careful wall I'd spent years building around myself without once asking my permission. But he also never once made me feel like I had to be smaller to fit into his life. And for someone who spent every day at Hartwell making himself invisible, that turned out to be everything. If you thought this was just a simple clash between two strangers, you were wrong. What started as a wrong seat has already turned into something neither of them can walk away from. Zane isn't letting go. And Eli, well, he's already standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than he realizes. So tell me, would you run or would you stay? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Echoed Hearts for more unforgettable BL stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.